in Asia. And do you have a participant from East Asia or Australia? No? Okay. So before we start the presentation, I will give invite Natalia Otel Belan, who is the regional director of Center for International Private Enterprise and is responsible for Europe and Eurasia, for a brief keynote speech. Natalia?
Thank you, Dmitro. Greetings, and again, good afternoon for those that tuned in Ukraine and other countries in Eastern Europe, and good morning to those on this side of the Atlantic. I want to start by thanking the Center for Economic Strategy in Ukraine for hosting today's event that brings together CIPE partners from Western Balkans, Moldova, and Armenia, as well as the esteemed Anders Åslund, Senior Fellow at Atlantic Council. That today we'll discuss the impact of foreign malign economic influence on emerging economies of Eastern Europe. CIPE is one of the 4 core institutes of the National Endowment for Democracy and a nonprofit affiliate of the US Chamber of Commerce. We were founded in 1983 on the principle that economic freedom and political freedom are interlinked, and they produce prosperous and well-governed societies. Today, our work is every bit as vital as it was back then. Worldwide, many democracies face both internal and external challenges. For a long time, continued economic growth generated tremendous opportunities. Autocrats have, however, preyed on the openness of modern economies. This is especially the case with corrosive capital, which originates in authoritarian regimes and lacks transparency, accountability, and market orientation. Foreign investment is traditionally perceived as a positive input in a country's economy. It often comes with technology spillovers, human capital formation, and international trade integration, contributing to the economic, social, and environmental development in recipient countries and overall strengthens their good governance practices. However, emerging market economies have recently experienced an influx of corrosive capital that flows from authoritarian regimes and does not always aid such development. Even though any capital offers certain benefits, authoritarians use a based economy and erode local governance in the places that receive their capital. Capital invested by authoritarian regimes, whether via state-owned enterprises or regime-friendly businesses, has a detrimental effect on the quality of democratic institutions, most importantly on the rule of law, and significantly increases corruption in the recipient countries. Consequently, the explosive growth of corrosive capital continues to be an alarming trend and is likely a contributor to democratic backsliding around the world. During the COVID-19 crisis, authoritarian governments have stepped up their efforts to the point of influencing how the public and recipient countries view their authoritarian regimes. Though in many countries, the negative effect of corrosive capital on democracy, human rights, and governance are well documented, the authoritarians work to influence public opinion via local media to portray favorably their investment and aid. Today, my Deputy Director, Eric Hontz, and our partners will share their insights about the impact of corrosive capital in countries of Western Balkans, as well as Ukraine, Armenia, and Moldova, to help us make a better sense of this challenge with a strong focus on how to address it accordingly. COVID-19 is one of the greatest challenges the global democratic community has ever faced to its capacity to manage crises. It is negatively impacting economies and slowing down, or in some cases, reversing reform progress. While many small and medium companies are at an inflection point, the private sector is likely to play a significant role in the post-COVID-19 economic recovery and reconstruction. At the same time, it must continue to play a positive role in improving governance. Because investors often assert their own business culture, expectations of conduct, and norms of business behavior through the investment, constructing investment supports broader economic and social goals, such as reducing inequality through the generation of wealth for a greater, wider number of citizens, or connecting markets and boosting integration. Constructive capital guided by market institutions business culture, and partnerships in the aggregate can create a virtuous cycle of wealth creation, improved governance outcomes, and a better future for the next generation through inclusive growth. Business and investors cannot afford to be passive. The world needs action to affirm the values of free markets and democracy that create a market for everyone and the opportunity for every citizen to thrive. Nevertheless, as long as in free societies in which citizens and independent institutions are unable to hold the top leadership to account to continue to exist, such regimes will continue to project their sharp power, including through corrosive capital. Any response to such power must seek to unmask and expose authoritarian influences within the democracies. The goal of this global initiative focused on corrosive capital is not to stop investment from such countries as China, Russia, or others. Investment is much needed in the emerging economies to create growth and jobs. Rather, the goal is to reduce the corrosive effect on local democratic institutions and markets and help build the resilience of local democracies by turning any investment into constructive capital that has positive spillover. We do this by empowering local stakeholders with the tools they need to objectively assess the impact of such corrosive financial flows and identify the governance gaps and weaknesses such capital exploits to produce a negative effect. There is, fortunately, no shortage of expertise and information on corrosive capital in many countries where CIPE's civil society partners are deeply involved in its analysis, from Europe to Asia and Latin America. However, because the challenge of sharp power is multifaceted, so must be response to it. The authoritarians must be contested on multiple fronts and levels, including within the institutions of the countries targeted by corrosive capital. And it will take thoughtfulness and innovation to meet the challenge. To this end, local institutions should work to detect and address the threat of corrosive capital. Part of the solution, therefore, lies with the international community. Various organizations, including CIPE, can support local stakeholders to advance democratic and market-oriented principles, not only by promoting an ethical and accountable business culture that fosters inclusive growth, but also by improving the rule of law and governance of public institutions. Our wealth of knowledge allows for significant cross-fertilization of ideas and contributes to growing worldwide awareness and understanding of corrosive capital phenomenon, as well as concrete ways to address it. To make countries more resilient to the effects of corrosive capital, CIPE's civil society partners both map corrosive capital's impact on critical economic sectors in their countries and propose necessary regulatory and institutional reforms with input from affected stakeholders. With CIPE, while CIPE is a global organization, its approach is think globally and act locally. Hence, you'll hear today from our partners. CIPE supported this organization to design and implement local projects to help close specific governance gaps that had allowed the inflow of corrosive capital and reinforce democratic institutions by fostering collaboration on formulating concrete solutions and information sharing among civil society, the private sector, and lawmakers. In this regard, governments, civil society, and business have an important symbiotic relationship. When they work well together, democracies and economies flourish. As part of our thought leadership, we're determined to work with all stakeholders toward this goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. So now I would like to invite Dariia, who is an economist as our center and the primary researchers of all types of corrosive capital. So Dariia, please.
Thank you, Dmitro. Before I begin my presentation, I wanted to ask, we have prepared a question for our audience. So Andrei, if you can share the poll, we would like you to participate actively, not just by listening, but by answering and contributing to the discussion by answering some of the questions throughout today's evening. So Andrei, if you can turn on the first question now, it would be great. So yes, our first question is just generally, what do you think about capital from authoritarian countries? As Natalia already said, it's sorry, disappeared for a second. Corrosive capital may be dangerous, but we wanted to have also to hear the opinions from our audience. Do you think all capital is dangerous or only state-owned, or whether you think that there is no difference to where the investment comes from and any money can bring benefit to the society? So yeah, you can vote in this poll. I think both audience and the panelists can vote in the polls. And while you're watching, I think I can start the presentation. So today, as Dmitry already said, our presentation today is based on our report on Russian economic presence in Ukraine. So we will release the full report later in September, and we will have both Ukrainian and English versions, so you can read whatever version you feel more comfortable in reading. And it will have much more details than I can address today. It will have more data on trends in Russian economic presence in Ukraine for the last 10 years, and we'll dive deeper in the specific sectors, such as sectors of critical infrastructure, such as energy and banking, and so on. But today I just wanted to focus on the key issue of why Russian capital is dangerous in Ukraine and what damage it has done and what damage it can potentially do, and what are potentially the ways you can deal with it and what policies we can do to address these issues. So first of all, we believe that based on our research, there are like 5 main ways in which Russian economic presence can be a danger to the country and to the economy and to the society more generally. So first, Russian economic presence is often hidden and concealed, and it's difficult to identify. So it either comes through offshores or it comes through or the beneficiary is not put in the registry, or the beneficiary which is put in the registry is not the actual beneficiary. Secondly, Russian companies and Russian government, Russian private actors invest in the critical infrastructure such as energy, such as telecommunications and banking and many other sectors. And when they capture control share in this critical infrastructure, they de facto have a monopoly position, which means they can influence not only the economy, but also the society, and they can, if they leverage this presence, they can turn off the critical infrastructure basically and the vital areas of the economy. Thirdly, long-term economic links with Russia make local companies and the economy as a whole dependent on its links with Russia. So even when a country or a specific company wants to stop trade with Russia or wants to stop their links, it's not easy to do so because their production is so tuned into the needs of their Russian counterpart that they cannot easily switch to other markets. The fourth reason is that the Russian companies sometimes deliberately invest and ruin production capacities in the countries they invest in. So their motive is not to seek profits or not to have some economic gains, but to simply basically ruin the production infrastructure and production capacities, either because they feel that these companies constitute a competition to their Russian companies, or simply they're acting on behalf of the Russian government and they're pursuing the strategic goal of ruining Ukrainian production capacities. And finally, when Russian capital enters Ukraine and uses all these previous methods described above, it generates some profits, and then these profits can be channeled into media and into politics and further influence Ukrainian media and Ukrainian public opinion and Ukrainian politics. So going first to the first issue I identified, which is hidden or invisible Russian capital. This is one of the figures from our research paper, which we basically tried to estimate the FDI flow to Ukraine from Russia. And as you can see, if you use official databases such as Ukrainian Service of Statistics, which is in orange, or Russian Central Bank, which is in blue, the investment from Russia is lower than if you use the unofficial, this is Mutual Investment Monitoring Database, which gathers all the large investment projects which are connected with the Russian owners, even if it comes to offshore rather than directly. So this gap between the all projects which are connected to Russia in any way and the investment which comes only directly to Russia, it represents that a really large part of investment from Russia, almost half, comes from not directly from Russia, but through the offshore. And we cannot see it in the official data. And if we cannot see it, there is not much we can do in terms of policy to address the threat this investment may possess. So, for example, even if we ban Russian companies to participate in privatization, these companies may invest through offshore, and they may not put the Russian individual as their ultimate beneficiary, and therefore still use this loophole to still invest in Ukraine. So as I said previously, there are several ways Russians can hide their presence. First, as I mentioned before, they can use offshores and use offshore companies rather than investing directly from Russia, and this data doesn't show up in the official statistics. And what is more, it is easier to report not the actual person as a beneficiary, but rather than some person who is just a director of the company, or who is just connected to the person who is actual owner, but he doesn't own the company himself or herself. Secondly, what we saw in Ukraine, some companies have sold, they have sold the companies, but de facto they maintain controls. So we can see in Ukraine there are a lot of journalistic investigations which report that certain companies which have changed their brand name, which apparently have changed the owner, they are still being controlled by the same ultimate beneficiary they used before. And such selling of the companies is dangerous, because to the consumers it may seem that this company is no longer Russian and this company is some Western investor which doesn't possess any threat, but actually often they only do so to mask their presence and they remain the ultimate beneficiary. Thirdly, we can see that although in Ukraine it is often the case that that ultimate beneficiary is not reported, even though according to the Ukrainian law the companies have to report the ultimate beneficiary due to quite low fines and not the laws are not always being enforced. Many companies fail to report the ultimate beneficiary, so we don't really know who the company belongs to, whether it's Russians, whether it's Ukrainians, or whether it's some other foreign countries. So again, Russian companies can use this loophole, just not reporting ultimate beneficiary, and be exempt from sanctions and from other restrictions. Another way to hide the presence can be registering companies on the relatives or acquaintances who are not, for example, under sanctions, to avoid these companies from being operated in Ukraine. So, for example, Viktor Medvedchuk doesn't officially own any TV channels or any oil companies in Russia, but his wife officially, according to their financial declarations, has a share in some of the Ukrainian TV channels and some in some of the oil companies in Russia. And even though Medvedchuk himself claims that he takes part in operating in the operational activities of these companies, So this is another way to kind of hide the connection to a certain company. And finally, if a person doesn't want to hide its presence, but this company is still put on their sanction list, the person can hire lobbyists to be removed from the sanction list and to be excluded to continue operate. For example, we know that Oleg Deripaska was in the sanctions list in the US. However, some of his companies were removed from the sanctions list, and this could be attributed to the work of lobbyists and to using this way to not hide their presence, but to allow him to continue to operate in Ukraine and in other countries. So the second point I had was capturing critical infrastructure. So, for example, according to our research, we have identified that 19 out of 24 regional energy distribution stations have some Russian investment. So it's not necessarily all of the energy distribution station owned by Russia. So it could be like 25% owned by Ukrainian state and 25% owned by Russia and 50% by someone else. But 19 out of 24 have at least some investment from Russian companies or Russian individuals or individuals connected to Russia. So we believe that this area is critical infrastructure, and capturing control, or at least capturing part of shares of these local energy distribution stations can allow the Russian owners to be involved in, for example, switching off the energy supply or making it more difficult to connect to the energy supply for businesses, and slowing down Ukrainian production capacities and business development. Also, we know that there are three major telecommunications companies in Ukraine, which are mobile operators, and at least in 2 out of 3 of them, there is at least some Russian presence. Again, this is not always the majority share, but at least some presence means that they have access to this critical area of telecommunications. And finally, we know that even though now we still have these examples, but previously there was much more involvement of Russian companies and Russian connected companies to critical infrastructure. For example, the famous example is Rosukrenergo company, which was connected to Dmytro Firtash, who is Ukrainian, but who worked with Russia to supply Russian gas to Ukraine, and basically controlling gas trade from Russia to Ukraine. So as we see now, we have much lower share of Russians in critical infrastructure, but nevertheless, we still have some of these examples. And then the next example I gave is ruining Ukrainian production capacities which leads to either help to the competitors in Russia, or just basically to ruin production capacities to weaken Ukraine against Russia. So here we focus on one of the case studies we have identified, which is the Dariia aluminum production plant. This plant was purchased by Rusal company, which is owned by, again, Oleg Deripaska. And according to Ukrainian security service, which has conducted investigation in this Rusal has failed to fulfill its obligations to invest in the company, and it even transported some of the valuable equipment which was located in this company to Russia. And Ukrainian security service says that it was a deliberate attempt to ruin Ukrainian production capacities to make Ukrainian aluminum production and metallurgy in general dependent on trade with Russia, because without being able to process this aluminum in Ukraine, other plants, for example, Mykolaiv alumina plant, has to trade with Russia because there is nowhere in Ukraine they can process their goods and products too. So This is kind of an example which was even investigated by Ukrainian Security Service, which is kind of an attempt to ruin Ukrainian production capabilities by purchasing full production plant and failing to invest in it and ruin its production capacities. And the other point I had in the beginning was that Russia often make Ukraine dependent on its economic links with Russia. So it can be, firstly, it can be due to the integration of many of Ukrainian companies into the supply chains with Russia, starting from the Soviet Union, and which continuing until today. So, for example, if the company was integrated in the supply chain with Russia and it hasn't made attempts to diversify and to produce other equipment which would be appealing not only to Russian market and to other post-Soviet markets, but to Western markets as well, it continues to be independent on its trade and its links to Russian companies. But more major examples, first is gas trade. As we all know, probably for many years, Ukraine was dependent on gas trade with Russia, and there were several so-called gas wars where Russia threatened to turn off gas supply to Ukraine to make sure Ukrainian politicians made right foreign policy decisions. Fortunately, now it's the situation with the gas trade is much better, as Ukraine doesn't purchase the gas from Russia directly, but it purchases indirectly from Europe. Other area is, which is also important, is nuclear energy. So in nuclear energy, for many years, Ukraine had to purchase fuel for nuclear power station from Russia. Now it's also starting to diversify and purchasing from Westinghouse company, which is another large international company which produces fuel for nuclear power stations. However, this process is slow and takes years and years to fully diversify and to fully switch the fuel supply. So it had Ukraine started purchasing this and diversify, and earlier this dependence wouldn't be much less now than it is. And the third large example is the Russian state-owned banks given loans to Ukrainian state-owned companies, making them dependent on these loans. So again, this is not, to the best of our knowledge, this is not happening right now. This is more before the Revolution of Dignity. But from what we know, many Russian state-owned banks were granting large loans to Ukrainian state-owned companies, for example, Ukrzaliznytsia, which is a railway company, but also companies in defense industry as well. So this makes these state-owned companies dependent on this money from Russian banks, but also it gives the Russian state-owned banks the access to the people in these state-owned companies, and it gives them ability to influence the decisions of the state-owned companies and in favor of Russia. And finally, as I said, often Russian companies and especially Russian state-owned companies use profit they made in Ukraine and in other countries to channel into the media or into politics to promote Russian agenda and to promote Russian image in this country. So while in Ukraine we know that Russian TV channels are banned, we know that there are some pro-Russian media outlets in Ukraine which are owned by Ukrainians, but they still promote pro-Russian message. And even though there is no direct evidence that they are funded from Russia, they are linked to some Ukrainian politicians, for example, who have links to Russian oligarchs or who have links to Russian politicians. And in politics, the same issue, because of the lack of the transparency of the party finance. We know that sometimes Ukrainian political parties receive funding from not really clear sources, but we don't know whether really comes from Russia or whether it comes from some other source. But we know that there is potential that Russia could be funding the pro-Russian political parties in Ukraine. And then again, there are also other important channels, for example, social media. We all know that Russia often uses social media, so-called bots, to influence public opinion on social media. And this is not only the case in Ukraine, it's also the case in other European countries and in the US, where I think there was even the investigation into the Russian bots and their influence on the 2016 presidential election. And then in Ukraine, there is also issue with church. So there is Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Ukrainian Patriarchy, and then there is Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchy, which is headquarters is located in Russia, and which can be influenced by Russian this headquarter to promote its agenda. And again, Ukrainian security services have had several investigations about several local Ukrainian churches of Moscow Patriarchate being involved in propaganda and so on. So these are huge problems. Is there anything we can do with it as a society and as policymakers, or is there nothing we can do, and whether, because the Russian presence is hidden so well, there is no way we can identify it and do anything with it. So I think there are several things we can do. So first, with the hidden presence of Russia, we can increase fines from misreporting of the ultimate beneficiary owner and increase enforcement. And then we can also promote anti-money laundering laws and BEPS plan to ensure that the money that comes, the less companies use offshores to channel their monies through, and even if they use offshore, that it is more transparent. Then with the critical infrastructure, many European EU countries have implemented investment screening mechanism to prevent unwanted investments in critical infrastructure. So basically, when they have certain areas which they consider to be critical infrastructure, and they can screen who decides to invest in these areas and prevent the investments which can be considered to be dangerous. Again, there could be potentially a trade-off between the wanting to improve and attract more investment and wanting to limit the dangerous investment, but this is the trade-off that has to be worked out, and the policy and the laws have to be written in a way that this trade-off is understood and enforced properly. And then with the ruin of production capabilities, again, in part it can be addressed by this investment screening mechanism, not allowing these companies which can ruin production capabilities to invest in the first place. But then if it already happens, you can pursue the criminal charges, like I mentioned in the example previously with the Ukrainian Service of Security Service and the Rusal company. And with the dependence on economics links with Russia, I think there is nothing really more you can do than to continue to invest and diversify your supply or your trade links to include other countries. And as I mentioned earlier, there is some good progress happening already in gas trade, for example, and in nuclear energy, just as two examples. And then with the channeling profits to influence media and politics and other society, I think there should be more transparency of party finance and media ownership transparency, and enforce the laws which are already exist on this transparency to make sure that we know who owns the certain media or outlet or who funds certain party, and if a person or an organization which is not allowed by law to fund this party or organization, the laws on this has to be enforced better. Thank you very much. I think this is all my slides. Andrei, maybe you can now share the results of the poll we had previously. Yeah, so we can see that most people agree that all capital from authoritarian countries is dangerous, and some think that only state capital is dangerous and private is not. But I think all of our participants acknowledge that there is at least some danger from capital from authoritarian countries. Thank you. I think, Dmitry, I'll give it back to you.
So as we see, no one have chosen the last option in the poll. So. Okay. So now I'd like to say, Dariia, thank you very much for the nice presentation. So now I'd like to invite our panelists to give us some broad context of the corrosiveness of capital in the world, and to name some examples from their home countries or other countries of their corrosive capital. I mean, from like other countries as both as a source country of an investment and the target country. So first of all, I would like to invite Anders Åslund, who's a senior fellow of the Atlantic Council. Anders, please.
Thank you very much. I'm quite impressed. This sounds like a very good report, and I had many points that I wanted to make here that Dariia made already. So I would like to make a few comments on the margin of this report as now presented. And my main message would be focus on the key points, what is really important right now. And I think that there are two things that are really important. First of all, transparency, as you emphasized. And it's not only a question of Russian owners, it's also a question of all other owners, because if it's in an offshore, we can't know who the owner is. And there's an awful amount of money abroad. It's commonly assessed now that Russian money held abroad, private money, is about $1 trillion. And probably 1/4 of this is held by Putin and close friends of his. I wrote about this in my book, Russia's Corrosive Capital, that was published last year. So transparency, 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 which you have, and then that the ultimate beneficiary owners really need to be checked. And Ukraine has one wonderful example that you did not quite mention, the banks. The National Bank today knows all owners of the banks, which shows that this can be done in Ukraine, and this should be done by other institutions on a similar. And it's also a matter of taxation, because offshores don't pay tax, and that means that they have an advantage over people who operate within one country, because people within one country, they pay taxes. And this is also a reason why the oligarchs are so dominant in Ukraine, because they don't pay taxes, because their money is in offshores, and whether they are Russian or Ukrainian or from any other nationality. And then my third point is focus on media. You mentioned this, that it's outrageous that Viktor Medvedchuk controls 3 television channels and also owns a quarter of 1+1. This should not be allowed. Viktor Medvedchuk was one of the 4 first people that the US sanctioned because of the occupation of Crimea on the 17th of March 2014. This is absolutely impermissible. But Viktor Medvedchuk had excellent relations with the former regime and also with the current regime. So he not only survives, but thrives, and obviously he operates with Russian money. So this should not be accepted. There should be complete transparency with media ownership, exactly as it is with banks. And my fourth point is the parliament. The parliament today is the main source of corruption in Ukraine. Parliamentarians have a miserable salary of a couple of thousands of dollars a month, and there are always people who are prepared to pay $10,000 extra to them, to each of them. So if you buy a majority in parliament, it just costs you slightly more than $2 million a month. And the wealthy people are very happy to pay this money. So the parliamentarians, if they think that they deserve $10,000, give them $10,000 a month, so that they don't become liable to corruption. So today, Ukraine's parliament is for sale, as each Ukrainian parliament has been all along. This is what needs to be fixed. It's good with the electronic declarations, but they are not sufficient. They must, since everybody's doing it, nobody's complaining about anybody else. Then I thought your examples on gas trade and nuclear energy was excellent, and also that you emphasized that 21 out of 24 electrical distribution companies have Russian ownership. I mean, this is outrageous. And in particular, that Alexander Babakov, who controls many of these companies, and he, if I remember rightly, has ownership in 10 of them. And he was one of the first people also to be sanctioned for the Crimean occupation, when he's being asked, oh no, it's not his ownership because it's some offshore that he doesn't know of. And let's see. So what I would suggest is that certain people should be prohibited of pursuing business in Ukraine. And there are quite a few of them. But I would start with Viktor Medvedchuk, Alexander Babakov, Dmitry Firtash, that they have disqualified themselves in the same way as in most Western countries. If you have committed certain crimes in the financial sector, you are not allowed to operate in the financial sector at all. And in Ukraine, it should simply be certain people are so criminal that they can't be let into business activity. And apart from that, quite a few people should actually be prosecuted. And now we know that people who get prosecuted in Ukraine are the civil activists rather than those who are actually committing the crimes. One objection that I have is ruining production capacities. Ukraine has 8 oil refineries, 7 of them are standing still, and they are owned by Ukrainians. When 4 of them were owned by Russians, those 4 were working and the others were standing still. So it's very difficult to say, but this Zaporozhye capacity, I don't think is much to have, and I would de-emphasize it. It's very difficult when you get disruption, and it's very much a question of the Russian sanctions. And perhaps the sanctions should be emphasized, that it's so dangerous to pursue trade with Russia, because whenever any Ukrainian businessman is successful on the Russian market, he or she finds that they are being sanctioned in Russia. So the sanction risk, the political risk is a bit. But thank you very much. Excellent report. And I should only say a comment about the US. In the US, you have a massive amounts of dark money that have been allowed since the Supreme Court verdict, Citizens United, in 2010. So the US is for sale. And the more money you have, the less taxes you pay, and the better regulation you get for yourself. In the last midterm election, there were more than $50 million on each side of dark money. So the US is really a terrible example, while by and large, the EU countries, in particular the smaller ones, have a very good standard. You can take as a comparison, an election in Ukraine costs $1 to $2 billion, an election in Sweden costs $12 million, in Germany, $100 million, in the US, $6 billion. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. So you might have interesting suggestions that we maybe should not pursue that particular countries or industries, but maybe the particular persons, right?
Well, also media and politics. Media and politics, not ordinary industry. Read aluminum, but electricity, yes. The infrastructure, important. What is done in gas and banking has and nuclear energy, I think, is very impressive. And so there Ukraine has done well. Thank you.
So now Eric Hontz, the Deputy Regional Director from CIPE. Eric, please.
Thank you, Dmitro, and thank you, Anders and Dariia and Natalia for starting out. And I just want to make a comment that it's been a pleasure working with the Center for Economic Strategy and your commitment to documenting the sources of capital and investment into Ukraine from Russia in this case. And while we term this as corrosive capital, we want to make sure that we want to be investor, anonymous. We really don't care who's putting money into Ukraine. What we care is the end results. And we want to have, at the end of the day, we want to have good markets. Markets require regulation. Markets require some oversight. And the markets require an effective governance regime in order to function properly. And so what these corrosive investments do is undermine those market systems, and they disrupt the very function of a market where there's limited competition. Conversely, if we take a look at the other side, CIPE has been looking at what are constructive capital investments. These are investments that are additive to value in an economy. So if we take an investor, like I believe Nespresso is investing into production capacity in Western Ukraine. And when they opened their factory, they instituted certain ecological protocols. They were very responsive to local authorities, and they instituted water reduction management systems. That's not a state requirement of Ukraine, but because they were saving so much money by introducing these new systems into their production capacity, other firms in the region were also interested in doing this. And so that's an example of an additive investment where a firm, through its own initiative, goes above and beyond any government regulations and then has a cascading effect, on an entire industry where they're doing better, they're being more accountable to stakeholders, they're adding jobs, they're adding value into the overall business ecosystem in the country. And if we look at this as not as a single investment or not as a single industry, but overall, and we look at Ukraine, it really is this, in a very interesting position. It's a frontline state in many cases, in many senses of the word, right? So you have this really a tale of two economies in Ukraine. You have one economy that is more or less competitive, more or less innovative, and seeks to engage with the EU, with the US, seeks to institute the highest standards of corporate governance, brings people like Anders onto their board of state-owned enterprises, if you're still on the board of Okrzaloznica, to make it more transparent and make the market function better. Then you have another Ukrainian economy. This is a Ukrainian economy that seeks to extract monopolistic rents, that seeks to push out other actors, that seeks to build moats to competition in the country. And these are the sectors of the economy that are not only influenced by Russian capital, but also Ukrainians as well, that seek to create a market that is not functioning properly, and that limits opportunities for Ukrainians. It limits opportunities for other investors into the country, and it limits the overall potential of the Ukrainian economy, which I think that we all agree here is really large. And this comes back to an issue that I was thinking about and how to characterize investment from these authoritarian states. So, you have Russian state-owned banks, state-owned industry, you have Chinese state-owned banks, state-owned industry investing into other emerging economies, and not only Russia and China. But at the end of the day, are these equivalent investments? What is attached to these investments? And I would argue that there's a difference in how these investments are made and decisions that are made going into these economies. They're not necessarily market-oriented or profit-seeking investments. They're not responsible to local stakeholders, and they're not achieved in a transparent way through offshores, right? At the end of the day, it comes down to markets, 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 and we want to have a competitive market in Ukraine, in other states. And the more competition that we have, we'll see corruption reduced and opportunities increased for Ukrainian citizens. Dariia went over some really key factors in screening investments and ways to stem the flow of corrosive capital, and that's closing governance gaps. So this is, where we work with local ministries, line ministries, to implement very constructive policies that allows for positive investment into the countries, allows for FDI flows, but at the same time seeks to disrupt some of those non-market oriented flows into the economy. We've seen in Southeast Asia, several groups of businesses try to engage with the public procurement system. In Ukraine, this has gone some way with Prozoro, but I still believe that there's work to be done there. And fixing the public procurement process allows for, again, the creation of a more efficient market. So you spread these government contracts over a larger number of businesses and individuals in the economy. And the last way that Dariia had mentioned was through investment screening. And so we look around the world at EU countries, at the United States, and I think that, to my mind, Australia has really worked up a really solid framework for investment screening, and I think that the world should pay a little more attention to what Australia has done, because you have a resource-rich economy, you have massive Chinese interest in securing those resources, but somehow for the past 20 years, the Australians have maintained a relatively clean and efficient market in their country, have both welcomed Chinese investment and investment of other nations, but still maintained their own national security interests, their own environmental standards, their own human rights and labor protections throughout the economy. So I think that Australia is really a leading model here for the investment screening mechanism. And I would like also to note that in Ukraine in particular, CIPE is working with our partners at the Corporate Governance Professional Association to produce an index of Ukrainian companies that are transparent and accountable. And that's forthcoming in the next few months here. Hopefully by September or October, we'll be publishing that report. And that's where we look through the disclosures of various Ukrainian companies, the ease of access to information about ownership structure, governance structure, which ways their management and senior management and board are engaging in Ukrainian civil society, and how they are, these companies are positively impacting Ukraine and the business community. And then hopefully we continue our work with CES in the next year to look at Chinese investment into Ukraine. It's a larger and a continuing increase of Chinese interest in Ukraine. And I think it's an area to explore. And again, to look at those specific policy fixes that could be put in place to both allow investment, but to protect Ukrainians and make the market more efficient in order to get the most opportunity for the most number of Ukrainians.
Eric, thank you. So Dariia, you see that the next topic of our research will be corrosive Ukrainian capital, or technically corrosive Cyprus capital, corrosive Dutch capital, Swiss, Austrian, I don't know, whatever. Okay. So now I'd like to hear some examples of maybe prominent examples of from countries of our region. So please tell us about like over-indebted industries or enterprises, demolished plants, etc. So we'll start from in alphabetic order. So Artak, Kyurumyan, Economist at the Transparency International Armenia Anticorruption Center. Artak, please. Microphone.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dariia, for very interesting presentation. And I would just like to mention 2 or 3 minor similarities that I noticed. For example, 2 out of 3 Armenian telecommunication companies are also owned by Russians, and Armenian aluminum factory is also owned by Rusal. So at least I noticed these similarities. What I would like to say that we carried out a similar review for Armenia, but we paid attention to slightly different factors. Our approach was that if Armenia will have strong government and strong institutions that will be able to enforce strict transparency and accountability rules, will be able to screen investments, then it will be less important from where the money, the investment is coming. But unfortunately, Armenia didn't have these strong government institutions. And actually, we had authoritarian regime for about 2 decades with all of its consequences. And that resulted in very dramatic changes in our economy. I would like to bring a couple of examples. Privatization of big enterprises in Armenia didn't go very smoothly. You mentioned about electricity distribution network. Our Armenian electricity distribution network was privatized in early 2000, I think at the same time when a couple of distribution networks in Ukraine were privatized. And actually, the tender for these distribution networks failed twice. And 4 Western companies participated in the first tender. That was AES Silk Road, Fenosa, Spanish company, ABB, Swiss company, and Électricité de France. But you know, our government that was in power back then started to manipulate with auction rules, with tender rules, and at very late stages of auction at the tender, they started to change the rules of the game, and all 4 companies left the tender. One noticeable development during this process was that at each next stage, the government was changing like the stake in distribution networks it's going to sell. Like during the first tender, it was selling 51% in electricity distribution network. It failed, and during the second tender, the government offered 75%. Finally, it ended up selling 100% to an offshore company that didn't have any experience in electricity distribution, that was actually trading in metals, and that had only turnover of $132 million. So while at the beginning 4 very experienced companies were participating, at the end it ended up in the hands of a company that actually, according to some information, was backed by some members of Armenian authoritarian regime at the time. And after 2-3 years, no, maybe 4 or 5 years, it ended up being a property of RAOYES. So our understanding was that this offshore company, supposedly owned by Armenians or backed by Armenians, was an intermediary company that was used to transfer assets to final real owner, Russian RAO US. We had similar situation in banking, similar case in our banking privatization. Our Armenian savings bank, during privatization, it was unexpectedly sold to an Armenian oligarch who was actually trading in wheat and petrol. And after couple of years, this person resold it to final Russian owner VTB. So we had similar these cases. One other feature of investments, especially Russian investments in Armenia, was that in many cases, this was the first investment of these companies outside of Russia, or the first investment in a different industry. For example, when in early 2000s, a Russian company acquired one of the electricity generating capabilities, Sevan Hrazdan Cascade. It's a cascade of number of hydropower plants. This was acquired by RAO US, and it was first generating capacity of this company that was engaged in distribution. Until that time, they didn't have like generating capacity. When VTB acquired Armenian Savings Bank, this was their first acquisition outside of Russia after the collapse of the former Soviet Union. In the former Soviet Union, I mean. So we had these interesting experiences, and one noticeable factor is that, as I mentioned, Armenia had its own authoritarian regime for about 2 decades that was actually cooperating with their Russian counterparts and arranging in deals, and many of the transactions carried out were not market oriented, so to say. We didn't have clear idea about the value of assets transferred to Russia. For example, just to mention one, Sevan Hrazdan Cascade, which has 560 megawatt power, its capacity is 560 megawatt, was transferred to Russian owner against $25 million debt. So Armenian company had debt to Russian one and $25 million, and this company was transferred. 10 years later, an American company acquired another generating capacity. A little bit, the capacity was a little bit less, only 400 megawatts, but it paid $180 million. So we still have doubts also about the second transaction, but you see the values of assets are so different. All these transactions were not based on market prices. We actually didn't have idea how they determine the prices of assets and how they how they negotiate transactions, who negotiates all these transactions. As I mentioned, we paid more attention to our government institutions, to our weaknesses in our government structures that allowed all this to happen. And here I would like to go back to what Anders Åslund mentioned about the role of the parliament. Actually, the parliament in Armenia failed in its supervisory function. It didn't properly supervise the government or transactions with public assets, privatization of assets, and the government did whatever it wanted. Privatization in Armenia was regulated by the law, but in several cases, the parliament took away certain assets out of the list of privatization and allowed the government to do whatever it wants with these assets. And we have very vague idea until now how all these prices and transactions were arranged. These had direct consequences for Armenia because according to global financial integrity reports, more than $10 billion were channeled outside of Armenia during this 2-decade period. This is a huge amount for Armenian economy. But it not only had these financial implications, it also had consequences for Armenian economy, other consequences. For example, when in late 90s, Armenia started to develop its gas infrastructure, Gazprom Armenia, which was back then called Arm-Rus-Gazart, 45% of this company was owned by the government of Armenia, 45% by Gazprom, and 10% by Itera. In 2013, Gazprom acquired the entire company. So in 2013, it became 100% owned by Gazprom. But this was not the only consequence, not the only result. Actually, in Armenia, we were always looking for alternative source of supply, and for us, it's natural to look to Iran. Iran has also gas supplies, but actually, in 2013, Armenia, our government back then, and the Russian government signed an agreement according to which Gazprom got actual monopoly position in Armenia until 2043. And now we cannot acquire gas from Iran, so we don't have alternative supply of gas, and it's we highly depend on supply of Russian gas. I would like to mention about the add to your story about channeling funds to TV and other media. In Armenia, we don't have this sort of problem because in Armenia, Russian public TV channels are broadcasted freely. And in addition to Russian TV channels, we have 2-3 channels owned by representatives, linked to representatives of previous regime, who also broadcast anti-government propaganda today. Our government is very democratic to a certain extent, and their suggestion to population is that we are not going to close any channel. The remote control is in your hands, so change the channel if you don't like it. It's very simple. So in our analysis, we came to conclusion that Armenia needs to strengthen its institutions. The parliament needs to play bigger role in supervision over government. We need to strengthen the Public Services Regulatory Commission because it has direct role in all these transactions, and it also approves tariffs. And in several cases, when approving tariffs, it transferred all the additional costs of inefficiencies to consumers. So whenever there is inefficiencies in these distribution networks and in Gazprom and other facilities, the consequences of these inefficiencies were transferred to final consumers in form of price increase. So we need to strengthen also these Public Services Regulatory Commission and probably law enforcement bodies. So we look, we made number of recommendations with regard to strengthening our public institutions. And we hope that if Armenian authorities go forward following our recommendations, we will have better opportunities to impose transparency and accountability rules, identify final beneficial owners of these investments, and provide equal opportunities for all investors. So it will be make Armenia a better place for foreign investments. This is all for now. I will be happy to answer to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Artak. So it looks like while we are here discussing the FDI screening mechanism, so the Russian government have a FDI policy that with like checklists that you should own as a telecom operator or oil processing plant or aluminum plant, or etc. So, so now we continue with examples from Moldova. I would like to invite Diana Lerushin, Executive Director of Center of Entrepreneurship and Economic Policy. Tatiana.
Hello, everyone. And first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to organizers, to CIPE and the Center of Economic Strategy for the opportunity to participate in the discussion of the risk associated with the corrosive capital. The application of this approach for the analysis and assessment of investment attracted to Moldova makes it possible to better understand the true motives and assets, the real effects of their impact of the interest in the general public. I should note that our center, our team on the center have just started assessing the Russian economic footprint in Moldova and its impact on domestic and foreign policy. However, even the first results allow us to draw a number of important conclusions and better understand how the interest of Russian economic influence is being used, how it works, and what to do about it. For our discussion today, I'd like to take your attention just to three maybe political cases that illustrated the dangers of Russia's economic footprint in Moldova. Think about the Russian economic footprint in Moldova in comparisons with Ukraine is relatively small. From this point of view, Moldova should be viewed as a part of a more significant problem, and maybe not so much as a goal, but as a Russian tool or instrument of influence in the region. First of all, of course, through the separatist territory in Transnistria between Moldova and Ukraine. From this point of view, it is important to understand not only the true goals, but also how is this instrument funding. In this context, the attraction of Russian investments, their protections, efforts should be considered in the frame of reference of their compliance with the national interests of recipient country, Moldova. As you know, Moldova practically does not have its own resources, primarily hydrocarbons. Moscow uses the gas supply not only to keep Chisinau in its orbit of influence, but also to finance the separatist regime on the left bank of the Dniester. The huge debt of Moldova gas to Gazprom, today it's almost of $7 billion, is used by Moscow in the negotiations of the Transnistrian settlement for various kinds of different conversions into federalizations, conversions or assets, or the removal of the weapons from the warehouse in Kolbasny, etc. The results of such kind of cooperation is a huge corruption in the highest establishment and not only absence of transparency of the negotiations process on the gas contract, but an unfavorable tariff policy, as a result of which the poorest country in Europe considers gas at the most expensive price in the region. As I have already said, Transnistria not only does not pay for the consumed gas, but uses it to generate electricity at the Kyurumyan power plant, the owners of course Raujes, and makes money by selling it to Chisinau. So it means that people from Chisinau, from Moldova, pay to Gazprom twice, and in financing the separatist region. Let's add that the unrecognized territory is a source of smuggling, all kinds of traffic of people, goods, documents, etc., and all the negative consequences for both Moldova and Ukraine. Both countries should establish good cooperation not only with the framework of the international project like EUBAM and for Frontex, but also across the interspectrum of the interstate to expert relations. Second case that I want to cite concerns the so-called Russian loan, 200 million euros at 2% per annum for 10 years, allocated by Moscow on the eve of the presidential election for a specific candidate, Igor Dodon, which will happen on the November of this year. This case was widely described and called as the Yanukovych 2.0 loan by analogy with the 3 billion received by Yanukovych for disrupting the signing the association agreement by Ukraine. And as you know, probably the Constitutional Court of Moldova rejected this loan, pointing out numerous violations and risks both in the loan agreement itself and in its negotiations. We have yet to study this case in detail, especially because show must go on. Since the President Dodon has resumed the negotiations to obtain it. It is obviously that in the context of a pandemic crisis, limited financial resource due sanctions and crisis in the hydrocarbon markets, such generosity from Moscow should have serious motivations. In many respects, it connected with Moldova's joining in the third energy package last month, July this year, which radically changed the context both for negotiations on the annual contract with the Gazprom and the conversions, as I mean, of its debt, which is essentially the corporate debt with Gazprom and its subsidiary Moldova Gas. Moscow's generosity in this case should be understood as a transaction to Plan B, replacing Moldova's energy dependence with financial dependence. And we believe that the approaching of the corrosive capital methodology will help us to identify the governance gaps and gaps in law enforcement in terms of threats of the economic security, corruption risk, due diligence appliance, and etc. As I mentioned, we are just on the beginning. And finally, the third aspect that I want to draw your attention to, Moscow is using Moldova as a platform to advance its agenda in regional and geopolitical negotiations. For instance, Moscow applied sanctions to Moldova after Chisinau signed the association agreement with EU. Afterward, Moscow instead to trilateral format of negotiations between Chisinau, Brussels, and Moscow, including on the ashes of DCFTA expansions in the Transnistrian region. This proposal, of course, was rejected by Brussels as referring to the relation between Moldova, bilateral relation between Moldova and EU. But we have a lot of examples. Another example is the so-called big package for Moldova, which provides for the settlement defrothing of the Transnistrian conflict through federalization, promoted by Igor Dodon at the Security Conference in Munich last year. So this and as examples require in-depth analysis and cross-country cooperation, in our opinion, of experts in order to reveal a real understanding of the goals, objectives, and methods of the Russian footprint in the region and in Moldova in particular. Building expertise using the experience of Ukraine, Armenia, Bulgaria, and Eastern Balkans will contribute to development of effective policy measures, investment attractiveness in the public interest rather than the regional kleptocratic groups. And in conclusion, as I say, in a month, we will be ready to present for expert discussion our first conclusion and recommendation on the application of the corrosive capital methodology in Moldova case. And I really look forward to continuing this interesting and very important discussion in the near future. So thank you.
Thank you, Tatiana. Thank you for sharing the experience, and we're looking forward to seeing your report from Moldova. So now I would like to invite Åslund Stefanov from Bulgaria, from the Center for the Study of Democracy. Åslund, please.
Thank you, Dimitro, and thanks for the this wonderful discussion, and of course thanks for CIPE for making us the opportunity to work both with you and with Moldova and with Artak in Armenia. And of course, we did a lot of work with CIPE, and we're a little bit further ahead also tackling some of the governance gaps that we identified in the Western Balkans. As I see that time has moved on and we're close to the discussion slot, I'd like to make generally 2 points. One is on the how we diagnose corrosive capital, and why is it so important that we are aware of it and that we know that there is a risk of that, of corrosive capital penetrating not just Eastern Europe, but I would say the European economy as a whole. Anders mentioned the 1 trillion outflow of capital from Russia. This is just a nominal amount. What happened with this capital outside of Russia is that it went through numerous offshore holdings right in the center of Europe, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, Netherlands, Ireland, Cyprus, and of course, some of you mentioned also the US, but I think we need to zoom in on Europe. And we've had a number of examples of how this corrosive influence could be problematic. And I agree, we don't need to speak just about Russian and Chinese, but these are the most important. And the reason for that is what we call state capture, and that we see the state capture both in China and in Russia, because there is no division between the the state and the private sector. And that is the most, I think that this is the area where we need to look at and into discerning the corrosiveness of capital, including, and I would say that this is also important for all the countries, including the total control of the judiciary and the media. Let me just give you an example very recently. I mean, some of you probably already saw the blast in Lebanon. And then if you look at the number of links of this ship It started from Georgia. It was registered on a company in Moldova, which went through an offshore in Panama. It received its correspondence in Bulgaria, and it wreaked havoc. It was traveling under a different flag and so on and so forth. So this means that there is somebody very intentionally wants to conceal the ownership of this company. These are not all these offshore holdings that are not meant, and these round tripping and whatnot, different financial terms, they're not meant to ease the investment, to make investors more secure, which is also a legitimate concern. We need to make this clear, because many of the countries in Europe, investments are not entirely certain. And the reason for that is, again, state capture. The reason is that there are political circles, there are political economic organizations that can actually steal or take away your business. That's why you need to protect your investment. And that's why some of these are very legitimate investments. So that's why it's so difficult to discern corrosive capital. And of course, it's very easy to say, you're just targeting Russia and China, but that's not true. The reason we're doing that is that there is no clear division between what's state and what's private, and when the private might be used for state purposes or for party political purposes in that matter. And that is what makes Russia's power both hard, soft, and sharp power. What we call the state capture power. It's a fusion. This is something that we've developed, and CSD's latest publication on Kremlin playbook in Southeast Europe is the fusion of all these different sorts of players. And on the one hand side, it's the deniability of the fact that there is a fusion. If you look at Russia and even China can claim that, that there is some sort of but Russia for certain, there is clearly window dressing democracy and market economy. So they claim, this is all business. It's, we're not really interested in that. But the problem is this complete control, and that if a private investment is seen as a potential extension of state policy, then it can be used, like we've seen in the case of Transnistria. Like we've seen in the case of Armenia, where there's been people have dealt directly with the Ministry of Defense, on energy issues. We've seen it on a number of occasions in Ukraine, although Ukraine clearly has made a clear-cut, very decisive, and probably the most far-reaching and most sweeping attempt after the fall of the Berlin Wall, I should say, and in particular in the former Soviet space. But of course, we could look back at the experience of the Baltic countries. I mean, look at all the different laundromats that happened. This is where they happened. I mean, it's not outside of the EU; it's right in the EU, and German banks and Dutch banks and everybody else participated there. Remember Austria? The Ibiza case, where we had a deputy prime minister. It was a sting operation, okay, but it could also not have been one. And in all these cases, and I'm finishing with that, in all these cases, it's not just the state capture or the fusion of state and private and media ownership and judiciary and parliamentary and church and whatnot, which is what you have in a very pure form in China. But it's also the local governance gaps. And I'd like to talk a few minutes about these gaps. In all these cases, what these corrosive investments have sought is some form of local governance gaps, whether it was some sort of a dependent judiciary, corrupt judiciary, whether it was a corrupt parliament, where they voted a specific line that allowed a monopoly in a specific business, whether it was a regulator that didn't pay attention or allowed, or whether it was a government or a minister or a prime minister that signed a privatization deal that effectively gives a natural monopoly to a country that might want to use it adversely to affect the policies of the host country. In all these cases, there is some governance gaps, that we need to look into. And let me finish with just an idea. I think the more we've discussed with CIPE and we've worked on the issue of corrosive capital, the more we discover that as much as it's tempting to find a roadmap of steps or simple fixes, it's not simple. This is for the long term. I mean, we've and in the case of Europe, in the case of the EU, I think the biggest governance gaps is that we need to understand first what is the size of the problem within Europe, because we still don't know that. We still don't know how Putin's pipelines, Nord Stream and South Stream, affect the different countries in Europe, and what kind of capital has played there, who benefits what, who gets what kind of business and what not. We still don't know how much of the, these plant companies in the Netherlands, why are they there, what kind of connections they've created, and so on and so forth. I mean, we still don't know what the very high-flying consultants in the city of London and in Frankfurt or in Paris, the banks that are exposed to the Russian market, what are their true allegiances? What are their, we are still not aware of these risks of corrosive capital. Okay, I'm not saying we should be stopping this, but I'm saying that we should be aware of this risk, and then we should have a reasonably long-term strategy in identifying that. All of the factors that you mentioned, all of the tools that were mentioned, like investment screening, like regulatory functions, like the parliament, like disclosure of conflict of interest. All these are the normal democratic checks and balances that make certain that we try to diffuse power, concentration of power, both in the economy and in politics. And this is what democracy and market economy is all about. And that means it's not simple, but that means that we have to start something. And I think the experience of Eastern Europe, the new member states of the EU, shows how difficult that is, and how different instruments it requires, from transparency to institution building, so on and so forth. But also the experience of Ukraine, of Georgia, showed how difficult it is to break with these bonds when you actually could have a malign intent on the other hand side that comes not just from a state, from official government, but it could come from private business or from media. And I think this is where we have to focus, on this merging of power that we've called very often state capture risks. Thank you.
Åslund, thank you very much. By the way, I was wondering what does it all under the moon mean in the context of our discussion today? Okay, so before we turn to questions and answers, I would like to pass the word to Dariia for some final remarks. Dariia, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just wanted to point out that we have another question to keep our audience active and to make sure you stay engaged. So Andrei, if you can turn on the second poll we have. So we have, you have listened to many people speaking about the dangers of capital coming from corrosive capital and from just generally people who have malign intent. So we're asking, what do you think there are the best policy options in dealing with them? And you have several options. You can select as many as you want to. So if you can vote now, we can see the results a little later. And while our audience is voting, I think I just wanted to address a few points other people said throughout the discussion. First of all, I would like to address what's said about the transparency of the banking system. I think this is a really good point. I think we also believe that the banking system became really transparent in the recent years, and that this really can be used as a model to increase transparency in other sectors, especially in the sectors of critical infrastructure. And I also agree about the fact that also Eric and Anders also said that another participant, that not always people who have malign intent, they're Russian citizens or they have Russian passports. For example, Dmitry Firtash, who was responsible for overseeing the gas trade, he was Ukrainian citizen. So is Viktor Medvedchuk. So it's not as clear-cut that someone is investing from Russia and he's necessarily bad, but if it's Ukrainian investment, it's necessarily good because there is this pattern of cooperation between Ukrainian oligarchs and Russian state-owned companies and Russian oligarchs, which both can lead to negative consequences. And again, as Andres already said, many of Ukrainian oligarchs are also under sanction in the US, and Medvedchuk is under sanctions as well. So I think it's very important to remember that when we're talking about foreign influence and foreign investment, not to forget the internal actors, which also have negative impact on the economy and cooperate with this foreign influence. Thank you, Dmytro. I think I would like to pass to you too for the questions.
Thank you. So now we'll start questions answers session, and maybe I will ask for first question myself. So to all the participants. So several months ago, Ministry of Economy of Ukraine prepared a draft law on the FDI screening mechanism. As so far, the idea is to screen only investment in such called like important industries in current version only in defense and telecommunications. So no extraction, no energy so far, no banking. But provided that the law will be passed and we will have all the institutions needed to screen the FDI into react somehow to them. But for example, telecom, as Dariia mentioned during the presentation, already 2 out of 3 main players in the industry are already Russian. So the question is, what to do with the capital that is already present here? So anyone from panelists could answer this if you wish. Anyone?
Well, I can respond that this is not an uncommon thing that you set ceilings and then companies have to sell off within a certain period. I mean, effectively, Ukraine has done that with the Russian state banks. Now it has not been fully complied with, but the Russian state banks have sharply cut down their activity and don't give new loans. So I think that you give companies a few years to withdraw. And of course, Russia has done so with media. So why shouldn't Ukraine do the same with regard to Russian media?
Yes, Åslund, please.
I think there is a reasonable, it has to be a reasonable approach, which means that focusing on certain industries or sectors like media, banks, telecommunications, the ones that are control critical infrastructure, and of course, this sizable is important. Now, how you decide on what is in this interconnected world, what could be a corrosive capital deal or not, is more difficult because, and this is where sound institutional environment and absolute certainty that you have a due process is important, and that nobody is impacting this due process of actually looking at certain deals, because you could have, for example, as I mentioned, and we've seen a lot of such deals, you could have investments from the Netherlands, from Switzerland, from Luxembourg, from Cyprus, not even having people with Russian names. It could be local people with local names. We've seen this also in the UK and everywhere. I mean, these are front people, that have acquired, for example, in Bulgaria, they've acquired 2 or 3 times the largest telecom company. And we just had an issue where VTB actually sold the largest Bulgarian telecom to itself after winning a tender in London. So in this respect, that was what I meant when I said that we need to have a common approach, in particular in Europe, where there is a wide diversity of understanding of how these issues should be handled. And for example, when we proposed a Europe-wide overview and a mechanism or an organization on anti-money laundering, you could be certain that immediately countries like Cyprus, Luxembourg, and Netherlands stood up and says, no, we don't need that. Now there is a need. I mean, we need to step up our efforts if we're going to be serious in that, because otherwise, a single country cannot possibly extricate itself unless its partners are on board too. And particularly when you're also very willing to attract investment, because investments in the end of the day is good. So you want to attract high quality investments, but I think that also depends very much on the process, on the due process that you have in the country itself.
Thank you. So now we'll let the audience participate in the discussion. So we already have a couple of questions now, so I will read them. So first questions, actually two questions from Nicholas Schmidt. So first question addresses to Mrs. Kyurumyan. So your examples were mainly from earlier in time and referred to privatization. Do you see any problems, particularly with public procurement in Armenia at the moment? And what progress has been made, or what reforms are being discussed? And second question is to everyone. So what's the best way of protecting the country from corrosive capital, but not at the same time to discourage clean, useful foreign investment?
If I may, I would like to add to the first question to Mr. Kyurumyan. I was in Armenia for a week, October last year, and my impression was that Russian state companies dominated completely. And the only foreign company of significance I saw was Rikal, that had bought the Ararat cognac factory. You mentioned the example of how Gazprom blocks gas imports from Iran, and it looked completely monopolistic. And I couldn't see, notice VTB and the electricity, yes, etc. And Rosal, everything seems to be controlled by either Russian state companies, or can you get out of this Russian capture? This is not only state capture, it's Russian state capture.
Thank you for questions. You mentioned about Pernod Ricard. I think in mid-90s we had also other investments. For example, probably you noticed HSBC is operating in Armenia. Its branches are everywhere. So it came to Armenia in mid-90s, and actually it brought a totally different culture, banking practices. And I remember in the second half of 90s, huge lines in front of HSBC, because this was totally different compared to banking experience that we had until then. Other than that, Agba Credit Agricole came to Armenia. So in mid-90s, the situation, Armenians were very optimistic about it. Yeah, you are right that energy sector is dominated by Russian companies. Say they had they acquired major generating facilities. Not all of them. We still have a couple of generating facilities, but they acquired a couple of very important. The distribution network was owned by Russian US. What we noticed in recent years is that Russian companies selling their property in Armenia to Russians of Armenian origin. Say, electricity distribution network is now owned by still a Russian company, but owned by a person from Armenia. And so there are a couple of other investments. So Russian companies, for whatever reason, transferred some assets to people with Armenian of Armenian origin.
Even more so in Georgia.
Yeah, so yeah, they are dominated in energy. Say very recently, it's just a couple of days ago, one of the telecommunication companies was acquired in Armenia, Russian telecommunication company. It was Beeline, now it was VEON Armenia, I think. And a couple of days ago, an Armenian entrepreneur from Armenia acquired it. But again, this Russian of Armenian origin got an investment in another company. So this is changing all the time, especially after the Velvet Revolution that we had in 2018, and the investment environment changed substantially. If I remember correctly, the question was also about procurements. The procurement environment before Velvet Revolution was very corrupt. Like public procurements, like several businessmen just refrained from entering this market. It was all settled, like everybody knew in advance who is going to win the tender. Many people did not participate at all. But I think after Velvet Revolution, the situation changed substantially. I still don't think there were major changes in rules and regulations and procedures. So the same rules and regulations with minor changes apply. But because our current Prime Minister is very much for fighting against corruption, actually, there is opinion that there is no systematic corruption. At least we don't see it. Business people are very optimistic. Now people who were refraining from participation in public tenders participate in public tenders and win these tenders. So I think the situation improved and improved substantially. But again, this is personal opinion. I think this is not because of substantially improved rules, regulations, and procedures, but because the government pays more attention to fight against corruption and imposes stricter rules and fosters competition between participants. So this is personal opinion. If I left any other question, please.
Also,
yes.
the second question of Nicholas was to everyone. It was about the balance between the protection of country from the corrosive capital and the discouragement of like a real clean investment.
Yeah. Go ahead, Artak.
Yeah, as I mentioned, in mid-90s, we had substantial investments of clean capital. HSBC came to Armenia. Pernod Ricard acquired Armenian brandy factory, although many Armenians didn't like it and still think there was some suspicious transaction there. But anyway, this was new business culture, new practices that came to Armenia. In 2012, if I remember correctly, even Orange, the French telecommunication company, came to Armenia and operated here for 2-3 years, but actually it was squeezed out of market after 2 or 3 years of operations, and our local Armenian telecommunication company, the third one, which was not owned by Russians, but by local oligarch, actually acquired Orange. So we have an impression that during this period of authoritarian regime, most of investments were actually through offshore companies and belonged to either Armenian the people connected to Armenian regime or by Russians. So anyway, this was like investment by autocrats from Armenia or from Russia, it doesn't matter. Now these investments declined substantially, probably because they are afraid to bring their money to New Armenia because they cannot engage in these suspicious transactions. They don't have this beneficial treatment, and everybody has a level playing field. And of course, COVID also has influence, and investments declined substantially. Supposedly, we will have economic decline. Hopefully not double digits, but it is quite possible. Anyway, the environment in general after 2018 is positive. People trust the government, and we hope that investments will come. Thank you.
Thank you. Eric, please.
Yeah, and so I think that the thrust of the second question from Nicholas was, what role, how do you both protect against corrosive capital but also allow for investment? And this is a balancing act, right? And at the end of the day, as Ruslan was mentioning, it requires the fostering of competition, right? So to my mind, the best way to fight corruption is for a government not to create extrajudicial bodies and anti-corruption commissions. It's to foster competition. And the more competition that you have in an economy, the less opportunity there is for corruption. So there's the market-based solution for corruption is to create more competition. And so, what can we do as thought leaders or thinkers or what? We can encourage pro-market policies by the government to foster these competitions, to have clear rules that are laid out equally for everyone, to have transparency in the market, and to have the market be accountable to stakeholders. By instituting these policies, we're going to create a playing field where Ukrainians can compete, where Western companies can compete, and where Russian companies can compete. If they come in transparently and submit to the rules of the game, there's no reason why anybody should be forbidden from participating in a market. I think I disagree with Anders that certain people should just be completely X'd out. Maybe if there's a condition or an independent judiciary finding. Anders mentioned the securities situation in the United States, but that's only one industry those people are forbidden from participating in, and that's after an exhaustive review process and a finding, where they are prohibited from participating in the finance industry. Maybe at the end of the day, maybe that is a solution, but in the interim, I think that the government, what is the job of government in Ukraine, in Armenia, in Moldova, in the United States? It's to foster a clear and transparent system of a market to create a competitive environment where we're limiting the effects of these corrosive capitals. And you need fundamentally property rights in that equation. And if we're kind of coming in and excluding individuals or kind of kicking people out without due process, to me that undermines the arguments, for the creation of an environment that is conducive to constructive capital.
Let me respond there. In many cases, you don't have a rule of law. In most countries, you don't have decent rule of law. And the US legal process is a joke. If you're a billionaire, you will not suffer. You can always buy so expensive lawyers so that nobody but the government can go after you, and the government only does in very few cases. Manafort is a perfect example of how you get away. No prosecutors dared to go after Manafort until the Mueller investigation came. So also in the US, where legal process is applaud, what you do when you don't have it. You block some. In Ukraine, I can name a number of people I won't, because they will immediately sue me for libel, since this is public, and who should be prohibited from pursuing business. And perhaps it's easier for the state to do something, but my big answer is transparency, transparency, transparency. And we have seen that very well in the Ukrainian case, but also in other cases, that transparency can actually be imposed. While rule of law is one of the last things you can actually impose, because the courts tend to be easily bought and completely corrupt. And Ukraine is a good example of it, but there are so many other cases. And you can say in Europe, no big banker is ever sentenced to prison, because there are always such good connections that you are being excluded. We might see one exception now with Wirecard in Germany, but in general, big bankers are too important to be sentenced to prison.
Thank you. We have a next questions, but again, two questions. So, question from Stephen Mechanic: when does a capital investment by a nation become corrosive, or there is no single starting point? And is it proves like intentionally for being corrosive, or it just becomes corrosive in the process of implementation, or both?
Let me give an example on this. That's the sale of the big refinery in Klaipėda in Lithuania to Williams, and then to Yukos, and then I don't recall how, and then Yukos was taken down. So it's very easy that a foreign investment is taken over by another company. Artak here mentioned what is happening with companies in Armenia. So it's very difficult to check if you have unknown companies abroad who is actually the owner of it. And it might have been perfectly decent. If you take Williams owning the Mazeikia refinery in Lithuania, that was fine. Also when Yukos held it, because it was a truly independent Russian company. But then it fell on hard times.
So any more answers?
May I just add, if I may? Based on what we observed here in Armenia, this capital actually brought corrupt practices and destroyed market competition in all sectors. And one of the features was, as I mentioned during my speech, is that it transferred all the costs of inefficiencies to final consumers. Say our Public Services Regulatory Commission, it has two roles: to protect consumers and to assure level playing field. But actually it totally failed with its first function and also with second function, because say with gas supply or with electricity distribution, these companies didn't have actually problem with raising their tariffs. The usual practice was that, for example, they would go to Public Services Regulatory Commission, apply for, say, 15% tariff increase. The PSRC will discuss it and approve only 10% tariff increase. And they will tell the people that, you see, we protect your interest, but actually, these companies were making huge profits, and actually we have an evidence with Gazprom Armenia that before becoming 100% owned by Gazprom, we reviewed the profits for several years. It was a loss-making company. Once it became 100% owned by Russia, it started to make profits, and most probably transferred these profits outside of Armenia. So these practices of mismanagement and transferring the cost of these efficiencies to final consumers is probably one of the features of corrosive capital.
Thank you. Åslund, maybe you want to add on this?
Yeah, just wanted to say on this point, at least from what we've seen around Central and Eastern Europe and in the countries in Europe that we've looked into, And we are now preparing also to release in next month, also look into Greece and Cyprus. I think you could have it both ways, as Stephen mentioned. You know, one is I think the guiding is again, like CIPE has defined it, capital that has some other kind of goals or aims, and this could happen both ways. You know, one is it could be malign intent. So the idea could be to use, like we had Gazprom or Lukoil money in Europe over countering shale gas exploration. So this is one area where clearly capital was used not to achieve profit, or at least not by the rules of fair competition, because clearly this would increase the profit of these companies if they keep competitors outside. And then secondly, so these are governance gaps in the country where the capital originates. You know, that doesn't, I mean, effectively, it's like the case of China is very clear, you know, because there is no private. You know, if the biggest capitalist in China, Jack Ma, tells you, you know, if they ask me for my business, you know, the Chinese Communist Party, I'll give it to them. That means there is no, you know, there is no separation between state and private. So there is no such thing, you know. So you can't really be certain whether the investment that you see is an investment by the state or is investment by a private company, or whether this investment won't be used at a certain point in time for something else than just profit or market. The same thing could happen the other way around. If there are governance gaps or state capture in the country that where the capital arrives, and this we've seen numerous times in Europe. I mean, think of the example of Greece. You know, think of the tens of millions of bribes that German companies paid, you know, from the military-industrial complex and whatnot. This makes the capital corrosive. You know, that does not necessarily mean it comes from from Russia and China, but it's because you have the local governance gaps that that change the direction of that capital. And this, of course, links to the previous question that I'd like to just very briefly mention. I very much agree with Eric, and it takes a lot of time. You know, and sometimes it's in all these countries that we're talking about, the Eastern Europe, Europe itself, but also the new market economies and democracies of former Soviet Union. It's very tempting to go like under suggested, you know, but that's if you have a good dictator. And imagine you could have also a bad dictator. So I think the one area where that we need to be very, very proactive. And again, there are no silver bullets. You know, it's one step at a time, every day, in and out. And I think that's why it's important that what the center in Ukraine does, or what the Artak does in Armenia, or what Tatiana do in Moldova, we need to do this on a daily basis. I mean, effectively, this means we need to create these institutions every day. And there will be challenges, of course. And I think there are two institutions that are critically important. One is the media. So knowing that you could trust the media, building this, that they will be looking into all these, you know, there will be watchful eyes, you know, looking at everything. And then there's the judiciary. One of our earlier studies in Europe found out that the biggest difference between Western Europe and Eastern Europe in the EU member states is actually corruption in judiciary. There was almost no such access in Western Europe, you know, in particular the level of judges. Whereas in the case of Eastern Europe, it was pretty widespread. So I think these are two very critical checks that we need to ensure that function properly. Thank you.
Thank you, Åslund. So 2 hours passed very quickly and we need to conclude. But before we do that, I would like to pass a word for the very last remark to Dariia Mykhailyshyna. I guess it's about the second poll result. Dariia?
Yeah, Andrei, could you please show and share with us the results of the second poll? And so we can see that our audience is quite optimistic. Only 5% say that nothing can be done. And most supported policies are high standard of party finance transparency and media ownership transparency. And again, during this discussion, we've heard many times from many different speakers that transparency is really important, and I agree with it as well. And the investment screening mechanism is also quite important, quite popular among our audience. And then stricter enforcement of laws and of ultimate beneficiary owner transparency and money laundering laws and BEPS plan also all have quite high support. So I think with that, I would like to thank all the speakers and the guests for joining us today. And I would like to remind you that we'll have the final full report published both in English and in Ukrainian, I think in mid-September. So you'll have more details. I wasn't able to mention everything today, unfortunately, and all the details about the banks and about the energy and about the gas trade and about so many other different things. But you'll have, if you're interested to learn more, you can read the reports. It will be both in our website and in our Twitter and Facebook and for Center for Economic Strategy. So thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much,
Thank
everybody.
you. Bye.
Very interesting and useful.
Thank you.